Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back to another No Sleep horror video. If you're here, you already know these stories aren't just spooky, they're the kind that crawl under your skin and stay with you long after the lights go out. Tonight, we've got a lineup of terrifying tales. Eerie neighbors watching from the dark, doppelgangers lurking outside your home, and even a death row inmate who just won't stay dead. If you think you've heard it all, think again. These are the kind of stories perfect for late night listening, whether you're winding down, studying, or just in the mood for some serious chills. And hey, if you're enjoying the content, don't forget to like and subscribe. We're on the road to 10,000 subscribers, and every single one of you makes that possible. All right, enough talking. Let's get into these creepy no sleep stories. My neighbor has been beckoning my children from his window at night. I, 33 male, live in Texas with my daughter Alicia, 8 female, and my son Jay, 4 male. Their mom has been out of the picture for the past 2 years, not dead, just a piece of shit, and I've managed pretty well as a single father. The 3 of us lived in a 2-bedroom in a nice neighborhood. I've got a solid job, and the kids are thankfully healthy. Everything was smooth sailing until one night, 2 months ago, during which I was awoken by Jay poking me in the face. He was sobbing violently, though I recognized it as the "I'm afraid" kind of crying as opposed to the "I'm hurt" kind of crying, which made me a little less worried. Jay's always been nightmare prone, so I assumed that's what was causing him distress. When I asked him what was wrong, though, he said, "The man in the next house is making scary faces at me." I'd heard my fair share of Jay's stories about monsters terrorizing him from the dark corners of his bedroom, but this was something new. I assumed he meant our neighbor's house, and the lack of fantastical elements in his description made me uneasy. It felt too specific to be one of his usual nightmares. I got out of bed and walked with Jay in tow to my kids' room. Alicia was awake in the top bunk. From the soft glow of their nightlight, I could see her crossing her arms and scowling down at her little brother. I didn't turn on any lights to give myself a better view of the outdoors and peered out the bedroom window. Their window had curtains on it, but for once they hadn't been drawn all the way, and there was a small opening between them through which Jay must have looked out. One side of the neighbor's house, the one to our left from the street, was visible from Alicia and Jay's room. There were 2 windows on the neighbor's side of the house, but it was too dark inside to see anything. I recalled from what I'd seen in the daylight that the window on the left, the one closest to the front of the house, was the kitchen. I wasn't sure what the window on the right was, as it always had its curtains drawn. I asked Alicia if she'd seen anything, and she shook her head. "He's always having nightmares and crying. I don't want to share a room with him anymore, Dad. I never get any sleep. It's not fair." Of course, hearing that made Jay start crying again, so I let him sleep in my room for the night. He has this TMNT indoor camping tent that he prefers to his actual bed. Honestly, at that point, I half suspected his nightmare to be a ploy to get me to let him camp. Anyway, I guess I'm a total pushover because he slept in that tent in my room for the next 2 nights. On the 3rd night, I was again woken up, but this time by Alicia, who was standing over me and shaking my arm. That kid hadn't woken me up in the middle of the night for years. When I asked her what was wrong, she said, "The neighbor was making faces at me." Those words and the fear in my daughter's voice really put me on edge. I closed the curtains when I said goodnight. "Did you open them?" "Only a little, but it's because I heard a weird noise." "What did you hear?" Alicia couldn't recall exactly. According to her, she had gotten out of bed to see what was going on, and when she lifted the curtain, she saw a light on in the neighbor's window. The curtains in the back room had been drawn back, and our neighbor was standing in his house, right up against the window frame. What was he doing? Alicia thought for a moment, and then made an expression I never want to see on my child's face, or anyone else's for that matter, ever again. I won't do it justice by describing it, but it looked something like this. First, she smiled with both sets of teeth, so that there was a little open sliver between the rows, and then she furrowed her eyebrows. She inclined her head towards me, kind of Kubrick stare-esque, and strained the muscles in her neck. The worst part, though, was what she did with her hands. She held out her left arm, forearm up. Then she clenched her right hand into a fist and moved it back and forth rapidly over her forearm. poor thing described it as playing the violin, but it seemed pretty obvious to me that my neighbor was pantomiming cutting. Disturbed, I told Alicia to stop and to not make either the expression or the gesture again. I was angry and confused. My neighbor, a man in his 40s, was a bit of a recluse, but he had seemed normal enough in the 3 or 4 times I'd spoken to him. I couldn't fathom why he would do something like that to my kids. After asking Alicia a few more questions, I realized that my neighbor might not have done anything technically, or at least legally, wrong. It wasn't against the law to make inappropriate gestures in your own home, but it seemed like he was targeting my kids specifically. Legal or not, I planned to have a little chat with him the following morning. My last question to Alicia was if our neighbor had made any other gestures, and she nodded. Then she started making beckoning, come here motions with both of her hands. I had Alicia sleep in my room for the night as well. I also checked out the window in my kids' room, but like before, I saw nothing. The house was completely dark. The next morning, before work and after dropping Alicia and Jay off to school, I spent a good 5 minutes knocking on my neighbor's front door. I figured he was home since his car was in the driveway, but he never answered the door. Eventually, I had to leave for work, and as I was walking away, I turned around quickly to see if he was watching me. He was, the coward. I saw him for a split second at the front window before he ducked beneath the sill and out of view. Clearly, the guy had problems. I yelled out to him to stop fucking with us, and then left. That same night, I put a plan in motion. While my kids slept in my room, I hung out in theirs. It was a Friday night, and I was ready to pull an all-nighter so that I could catch my neighbor in the act. Although I trusted my kids, I wanted to confirm that there was actually something nefarious going on before I escalated things. I made sure the house was locked up and all the curtains drawn, tucked my kids in, and sat on the floor under the window in their room. At around 9, I started marathoning midnight mass on my phone. I didn't want to wear headphones and miss any strange sounds, so I kept the volume low and mostly read subtitles. At midnight, I started to hear strange sounds. Like Alicia said, it's a bit hard to describe. Best I can do is that it was this low, repeated clicking sound. You know the chk sound you make to beckon a horse? It was something like that. All I knew is that the sound was undoubtedly coming from a person. After a few minutes of this, the sound switched to what I think was supposed to be a whistle, but it came out all wrong, like someone sucking breath in through their teeth. The sound was so crisp that the neighbor's window must have been open, which was an unsettling thought given that there was only around 15 feet of space between our houses. Certain that the neighbor was at his window and that this was my best chance to see him, I stood up and pulled the curtain back in one motion. I saw him right away. There was a dim light on in his room, allowing me to see that horrible expression Alicia had made the night prior. It was one thing to see my child's recreation, but it was far more frightening on an adult. His window was indeed open, and his arms were stuck out into the cold night, violently swiping against each other in a grotesque mimicry of self-harm. When he saw me and realized that he was looking at another grown man and not some poor child, he stopped his erratic motions. His cartoonish grin faded, and another, more genuine emotion settled over his features: rage. The man grabbed the window and slammed it shut, then closed the curtains with the same forcefulness. I let my own curtain fall. I was a little shell-shocked, I think. Of course, I was perturbed by the sight of the man, by his face and his movement, and the fact that he'd been doing that for who knows how many nights now in an attempt to frighten my kids. However, another detail stuck out as even more concerning to me, which was the fact that I genuinely wasn't sure if the man I had just seen was my neighbor. I'd seen him so few times in the years I'd lived in that house, and I was having trouble conjuring up his face. I sat on the floor for a minute, my blood thundering in my ears. I definitely had enough evidence at that point to call the cops, right? Just as I was about to pull out my phone, I heard a tremendous smack against the glass of the bedroom window. After a brief hesitation, I pulled the curtain back again. There were no lights on in the neighbor's house, and there was also no one outside from what I could see. I pulled the curtains back a little further and saw a handprint in the top corner of the window pane. It's worth noting that our house is on a raised foundation, and that particular window is very tall. So, even though the window is on the first floor, the man outside would have needed an insane vertical to get his hand up there. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. As I explained the situation to them, I quickly walked around the house to see if I could catch a glimpse of the man. My last stop was my bedroom. Once inside, I locked the doors, and while still on the phone with the operator, I took my handgun out of the safe in my closet. My heart was beating out of my damn chest, but I knew I had to stay calm, even more so when I saw that Alicia was awake and looking out of the tent at me. I reassured her in as few words as I could, whispering that we were okay, but we had to stay very quiet. I sat on the edge of my bed, my firearm ready and my ears straining. My kid's tent was in the corner, and to the left of the tent, in the middle of the wall and directly across from where I sat, was a window. After what felt like an eternity, I saw something. It was a cloudless night, and the moonlight was bright enough that I could see a silhouette through the white curtains. The dark shape was nebulous at first, but became more clear as the man outside stepped closer to the window. Somehow he knew which room we were in. The silhouette didn't move for several minutes, and I remember being thankful that, from the angle at which she sat, Alicia couldn't see it. Then, something happened that I couldn't entirely wrap my head around. The man stepped back from the glass and raised his arms, making a Y shape with his body and his limbs. Only, his arms were far too long. They seemed to be double the length that they should have been, each arm about the same length as his entire body. I thought at first that he was holding something, maybe two pipes that just appeared to be an extension of his limbs, but I could clearly see two hands at the ends of the extremities. I could see 5 fingers on each hand, flopping around slightly as the man brought his arms closer to the window. Thud. 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 I stood up and readied myself to shoot, but just then the sounds of sirens pierced the quiet night. The man outside banged his hands against the window one last time, and then it was as if someone had sliced his arms at the elbows. His forearms seemed to shear right off, and the man took off running before they so much as hit the ground. When the police officers announced themselves, I answered the door and explained the situation to them. 2 officers, a man and a woman, asked me a few questions about my neighbor, which I assume was necessary to establish probable cause for a search. Once finished, they told me to stay inside with the doors locked while they investigated the neighbor's house. I watched them through the window of Alicia and Jay's room. They knocked on the neighbor's door, and when no one answered, they tried the front door handle. I watched the unlocked door swing open. The 2 looked at one another and then entered. I'm not sure what they found inside that house. All I know is that when they emerged a few moments later, they both looked very disturbed. When I went outside to ask what they had found, the female officer told me simply, "Your neighbor's dead." The rest of the night was a blur of strangers in uniforms filing in and out of my neighbor's home. Some came to my porch afterward to ask me questions, and none offered me any answers. They moved with tight-lipped efficiency, their faces guarded, their words clipped. At one point, I wandered to the side of the house and found several people photographing something on the ground outside my bedroom window. Before they could ask me to leave, I made out the gruesome shape of 2 human arms. The kids and I have been staying in my parents' apartment for months, and I think everyone, even Jay, is getting tired of the cramped living situation. We can't stay in the house. Alicia is way too traumatized for that, and I wouldn't be comfortable staying there while the murderer is still at large anyway. I want to sell the damn house, but our story going semi-viral is making that difficult. After all, who would want a house that, thanks to the news, has become permanently associated with phrases like dismemberment and days of torture and victim barely recognizable as human? My husband wanted a threesome for his birthday. My husband's 30th birthday was coming up, and I wanted to do something special for him. He's always a bit cagey about asking for what he wants, but this time, when I asked, he had an immediate answer. "Would you be open to a threesome?" What? He must have seen the look on my face, because he immediately went into cleanup mode. I was more than enough for him, It was just something he'd always wanted to try. It could really spice up our love life, which was already pretty great, I thought. He understood if I wasn't comfortable with it, but he really thought it could be amazing for us. He just kept laying it on. I told him I needed to think about it, and he seemed to understand. After taking a couple of days and talking to my sister, I told him that I'd be willing to try it one time, and we'd see how it went. He was thrilled. He immediately started going on about this one person who he knew might be open to it. At that point, I thought to myself, if her name came immediately to mind, is there already something going on? But I dismissed the thought as nerve-induced paranoia. We negotiated some ground rules, and he set up a meeting. When I got there, the first thing I noticed was how much she looked like me. He definitely had a type. We talked, and she seemed pleasant enough. So we made plans for the following Saturday night. When Jenny arrived, we sat around chatting nervously and drinking wine, mostly me, and then we got to it. I was nervous, but I think it went okay. My husband paid sufficient attention to me, stuck to our rules, and seemed to have a good time. In the morning, we said goodbye and sent her on her way, but then he began asking when we could do it again. I reminded him that I'd said once, but then he asked, "Didn't you have a good time?" And the pressure started. I also noted that my hair was a little shorter in one spot, and there was a locket I couldn't find, but it wasn't a big deal. I just wanted to get back to our normal life. The next week, we were out when we ran into Jenny at the store. We got to talking, and she asked if we'd be up for a repeat. My husband said, "Absolutely." When we left, I asked him what the hell he was doing, but he just said he thought I'd be into it. After several conversations, I gave in and we scheduled another get-together. This one also went well, and we bid her farewell. We then ran into Jenny again the following week, and I couldn't help but notice that she looked even more like me than she had before. Her hair had darkened to match my shade, and her lips seemed a little fuller, like mine. I mentioned it to my husband, but he said I should take it as a compliment. She probably just liked my look. The next week, I was out running some errands, and I saw her. I started to go up and say hello, but something told me to hang back. And lo and behold, who should come walking up to her but my husband, who leaned over and gave her a kiss. That asshole. I decided to eavesdrop, and I heard him saying that everything was going according to plan. He said that the wine has worked perfectly and that he'd have more samples later to follow the hair and the locket. At that point, I had no idea what the hell was going on, but I had a bad feeling. Later that night, my husband suggested another get-together. I thought about calling him out, but at this point, I wanted to know what the hell was going on, so I decided to play along. When she came over this time, I pretended to drink the wine, but spit it out before we started. Then we went to the bedroom. This time, he seemed more into her than me, which hurt, but I was done trusting him at this point. Afterward, I pretended to sleep, and I noticed him cutting off more of my hair and swabbing my skin and then leaving the room with her. I tried to follow and listen, but I could only hear some of the conversation, the process and metamorphosis, and almost ready. I went back to bed and lay down, utterly confused. The next day, while he was at work, I went into his office and, after an extensive search, found a hidden drawer with a book entitled How to Make the Perfect Wife. What the fuck? I read a bit. It was about using magic and science to create an exact replica of your current wife, but better. Was this real? How dare he? My mother always said to us girls, "Don't get mad, get even." She was a smart woman. It was time I listened. The next weekend we had Jenny over again, but this time, after we were finished, I woke up tied to a rack in the middle of the room. "I'm sorry, dear," said my husband, "but this just isn't working out. It's not me. It's you, but don't worry, soon I'll have a better you." With that, he gave a potion to Jenny and she began to morph into an exact copy of him. The look of shock on his face was one of my favorite sights ever. "Surprised, dear?" "Yes, I discovered your ruse. Would it surprise you to learn that the last batch was filled with your DNA, not mine?" Then I looked over at the thing formerly known as Jenny. Kill him. And it did, violently. I woke up the next morning, cuddled with James. He made me breakfast and asked about my day, all while telling me he loved me. He was the perfect husband. I just found my wife outside. I'm sitting here freaking out. It's 3:17 a.m. and I just found my wife outside. This is going to be a mess as I'm still shaking, but let me explain it as best I can. So a bunch of years ago, we lived in another house. One night I woke up in the middle of the night because I heard noises coming from the other half of the house. I quietly opened the bedroom door and immediately saw a light on in my wife's study, which was situated next to the kitchen. The house we lived in was a few blocks away from the bad neighborhood. So my immediate thought was that someone had broken in and was going through the stuff in my wife's room, as my wife had come to bed with me several hours prior, and as far as I knew, she was still in bed. I crept through the house and was ready to confront the person in the room when I realized that it was my wife. In my still half-asleep state, I just assumed she was still in bed. Turns out she had woken up, couldn't get back to sleep, and so went to her room to browse Facebook or whatever for a while. I had almost confronted my own wife, thinking she was a burglar. Now, in our current house, we have a screen door and a wooden door. The wooden door has a deadbolt on it, and you have to make sure that you take the house keys with you because if you close the wooden door, you're not getting back in unless you grab the hidden spare key or knock on the door/window to be let back in. So it's about an hour ago, I'm woken up by the front door rattling. I immediately grab my phone and pull up the security camera located right by the front door. To my surprise, I see my wife standing there, kind of shivering. It's definitely her because we've been married over a decade and I know what my own wife looks like. She's dressed in the same clothing she wore today, a red top and black pants. 100% her. I don't know what she's doing outside, but she is. Confused, I roll over and there's my wife fast asleep. Remembering the incident in our last place, I use my phone screen to shine a light on her and confirm that it's definitely her and she's definitely in the bed. At this point, I'm really confused. I get up and make my way through the house to the front door. As I walk into the lounge room, our cat looks up at me, half asleep. Normally, she's super curious about stuff going on outside, and I would have thought that hearing the screen door rattling would have caused her to be at the door trying to see what's going on, but it's as if she hasn't heard a thing. I stand by the door and call out, "Who is it?" "It's me. Hurry up and let me back in. I'm freezing. I went outside because I heard something but forgot to take the keys in my bag with me." That absolutely sounds like my wife. Accent, intonation, knowledge about where her set of keys are, everything. But I'm not convinced because I've just seen her sleeping in the bed with my own eyes. "Hold on a second," I tell her. Now I'm heading back through the house and into the bedroom. I wake up my wife and say, "This is really fucking weird. You have to see this." I open the camera app and show her the front door. She's still at the door, looking around, wondering what I'm doing, because all I need to do to let her back in is turn the handle on the deadbolt and open the door. My wife says, "What the fuck? When was that recorded?" I tell her, "It's not. This is live. You're standing outside by the front door. I just went down there and asked who it was, and your voice told me it was you, and that I should let you back in because you're freezing and you left your keys in your bag." My wife gets up and peers through the bedroom window, as you can just see the front door alcove from there. She gasps and pulls the curtains shut. She turns around, and I'll never forget the look on her face as long as I live. She's terrified. "That's me," she says. At this point, I'm freaked the fuck out. I'm wide awake. I'm speaking to my wife, and I'm physically touching her while trying to peer out the window with her. But there she is, standing outside in the very outfit she wore today. Same hair, same glasses, same everything. We walk into the lounge room and I grab the big torch I have. It's a big, sturdy, metal, super bright light. Great for blinding people and hitting them if they get too close. We stand by the door again. "What's your name?" I ask. She tells me her full name, including her middle name. It's correct. "What's your birth date?" She tells me. It's also correct. "What did we have for dinner tonight?" She tells me this too and tells me that I cooked it. This is right too. I can hear my real wife standing next to me, trying to control her breathing as she's scared out of her wits. I nudge her and whisper, "Ask her something only you would know." After a moment to steady herself and think of something, she speaks. "When we last stayed with my parents, what change had Dad made to my old room?" There was a pause. "Who is that?" the person outside said. "Why aren't you letting me in? You know it's me. You're starting to freak me out here. Who is that inside with you? Is that a recording of me? What's going on here?" I said, "Answer the question. What change had been made to your room when we last visited?" Another pause. Then finally, there was a second bed added, as Max and Damien, my brother-in-law's 2 kids, sleep in there while visiting mom and dad. There's an audible gasp from my wife next to me. Now we're both freaked out. I grab her hand and lead her back into the bedroom and turn the lights on. We're still awake, watching the cameras. The other person walked towards the backyard, presumably to grab the spare key, but that was about 40 minutes ago, and I haven't seen them since. I'm too shit scared to go to bed, because I'm scared that this person, who knew everything about my wife, will find the spare key and enter. I don't know who the fuck they really are or what they want, but I'm not sleeping. I died for 6 minutes in 2003. Heaven isn't what we think it is. With apologies to the religious, I feel my story must be shared. In 2003, when I was 15 years old, my heart stopped for 6 minutes. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, at the point in my daily routine when I walked home from the bus stop. In the 4 blocks between the corner where I hopped off the bus and my front door, I started to feel nauseous. It came on suddenly, without warning. I'd felt just fine all day, ate a lunch of Bosco sticks and marinara sauce, something I'd eaten hundreds of times throughout high school. Before I had an opportunity to consider alternative causes, I broke out in a cold sweat. Then I felt the curious flutter in my chest. My heart slipped into what I later learned was an episode of ventricular fibrillation. I became breathless and collapsed. What happened next has been told to me after the fact. I apparently sprawled in the road where a woman driving a hatchback nearly crushed my skull beneath her tires. Instead, she screeched to a halt, tried to rouse me, then dialed emergency services when she failed to do so. EMS arrived to discover my heart had stopped beating. I was dead, technically. They transported my body to the hospital and somewhere along the way managed to shock my ticker back to life. Thus began a harrowing weeks-long journey through the American healthcare system that led eventually to an ablation, pacemaker, and mountains of debt my family's still dealing with. But my heart's all right, and thank it is, because what I learned that day has taught me never to thank God for anything. Because for those 6 minutes, as my lifeless body traveled across the city, accompanied by 2 paramedics working tirelessly to revive me, my soul transcended our world to visit the hereafter. During my visit, I learned things about our universe that I wish I hadn't. Perhaps in sharing my story, I might help our species prepare for what comes after we expire. It began with light, blinding, white, pervasive. It bathed me, calmed me. It was everything they tell you about. Beatific, welcoming, the stuff of spiritual experiences. I had the distinct feeling of ascent, like the light was lifting me skyward. I passed through several sets of gates, which my dizzied consciousness hardly registered. Upon reflection, I don't believe they were physical in any sense, and yet I recall the feeling of admittance, as if they might have prevented me from rising had they remained closed. In any event, I arrived in a place without dimension, a place beyond reality. It only made sense while I occupied it. I don't believe a corporeal being can make sense of the astral plane. Something about its intangible existence defies translation. So what I came away with were more impressions than images. I was not alone. Several life forces enclosed me upon my arrival. At first, because of my Christian upbringing, I believed them to be angels. In my incorporeal form, I made the spiritually equivalent gesture of opening my arms, anticipating their embrace. Instead, I felt myself shackled by their powers, like a collared dog. Humiliation and terror came over me. These were not the ethereal beings I'd been led to believe await us. These were cruel, unsympathetic overlords by whom I was fettered. Why, I thought, my soul wailing like a petulant child. Something like laughter returned, but it was cold, mocking. Thoughts floated into my consciousness like birds winging in and out of sight. They delivered some horrifying truths about existence that I'll do my best to relay to you now. Our universe, like many others running parallel to it, contains a pittance of the total energy in existence. It is a farm used to produce souls which only arise in the precise conditions found in our cosmos. When you hear scientists talk about the improbability of the existence of our Goldilocks universe, it's because they don't actually come into being spontaneously. They're designed, and the hands that craft them are not benevolent gods, but rapacious beings with little care for the creatures they create. Our ultimate purpose, I learned in the custody of the spirits that shackled me, was to ripen until we were ready to serve them on their higher plane. The Big Bang gave birth to the universe to give rise to life to eventuate in humanity, a sufficiently conscious organism that may be harvested for use as slaves on a higher plane, where time and space dissolve into an eternity we spend in servitude. 6 minutes in heaven felt like a lifetime, which I spent amusing what I perceived to be a childlike spirit with a penchant for psychologically distressing manipulation. It batted me around like a cat with a caught mouse, reveling in the pain it produced. Physical discomforts we imagine hell inflicting upon us pale in comparison to the torture of soul pain. Loss of a loved one comes closest, that piercing emotional damage resulting from trauma. When it became clear my time had not yet expired on Earth and I was to return, I was told not to reveal their existence to the rest of my kind. My reward, they communicated to me, would be a marginally improved station among the slave population. Alternatively, if I managed to convince others of their existence, new horrors would await me when I returned. I can't imagine anything worse than what I experienced, subsumed beneath an ineffable grief and torment. For weeks, I tried to explain to anyone who would listen what I experienced. Everyone told me I'd suffered a very serious and traumatic experience for a young man, that the event left scars on my psyche as well as my heart. I gave up trying to convince them. I slowly began to convince myself that what they'd told me was true. I'd simply imagined it. A death dream, as it were. The mind reckoning with its own imminent demise, trying to make sense of the experience. Then I met someone who claimed to have met God. This was a few years later, when the author of a nonfiction book recounting their near-death experience visited my hometown. I won't reveal the author's name as I don't want to invite a lawsuit, which I'm sure he'd launch against me if he read that I'd besmirched him. I attended a reading and afterward confronted him about his tale. I looked him in the eye and asked if he really met God, something I'm sure he's dealt with hundreds of times. He smiled and nodded, assuring me that yes, God is real and is filled with love. On a lark, I decided to tell him that I knew the truth, that slavery awaits us all. A flicker in his gaze betrayed his knowledge of the fact. He really had died and visited the afterlife, but lied about it in his book, because he knew. He knew the truth of heaven, the horrible place our souls are bound for. There's a death row inmate who we've executed over a dozen times. He won't stay dead. We killed Joseph Glass for the first time on August 18, 1999. I knew he was a strange case since day one. Never seen a guy so happy to die before. It was like we were doing him a favor. He refused the automatic appeal. He refused to be seen by a chaplain. He just wanted it over with. It had only taken a little over a year, and it was already time for him to make his appointment with God. He freaked me out, just passing by his cell. He was like our very own Hannibal Lecter, the way he just stood there in the back of his cell like he'd been waiting for you. The lights always burned out in any cell he was in, and maintenance had gotten tired of fixing them. Not that he seemed to mind in the slightest. The darkness seemed to swallow his top half, and all I could see were the whites of his beady little eyes poking out of all that black. Billy drummed his baton against the bars. "Up and at 'em, cowpoke," he called in that mocking tone. "Time finally come for you to pay what you owe, you sick son of a..." "Billy," Warden Taft silenced him with a word, "if you can't act like a professional, you're going to have to sit this one out." Billy paused and licked his chapped lips. "Nah," he muttered, "this is a show I can't miss." Glass seemed to tick Billy off more than any prisoner before him. He liked them to at least pretend to feel sorry for what they've done, or act scared of what's coming to him. This one didn't even have the common decency to shed a tear. He was as stone-faced as a statue, even while being marched to the chair. Billy liked to joke sometimes that we ought to take the guy out back with some car batteries and really put the fear of God into him, get him to cut out that stoic act. I think he was only half joking. After what this guy did to those girls, well, Billy has a daughter, so I guess it struck a chord. We all watched him fry. The warden, his closest men, the thin-faced man representing the commissioner of corrections, the prison physician, the families of those poor girls. It couldn't have gone more by the book. Only oddity I'd noticed at the time was that the stench of death never quite left the clothes I'd worn that day. And then the next morning, we came into work to see the whites of those beady little eyes staring at us from the darkness again. "Good morning, sirs," he said, just as he did every morning in that airy, hoarse little voice. I'll admit it. I dropped everything I was carrying, stumbled back, stammered like a confused child. Hell, I almost screamed. You're not. Yeah, you're supposed to be." "I don't know what you mean, sir." He leaned in like he was trying to stare a hole through my chest. His tone almost sounded disappointed. "You never came for me. You promised me that yesterday would be the end, sir, but you never came. I waited all night long. Why did you lie to me?" Me and Taft looked at each other. We both had the exact same question on our minds. If Glass was still alive, who the hell did we roll into the morgue last night? Jesus Christ. Taft gagged when he pulled back the cadaver cover, stumbling away. "It's Billy." I looked. I know I shouldn't have, but I couldn't help it. And I'll be forever haunted by the sight of my friend lying there on his back, mouth agape and cloudy eyes staring into the ceiling, open wide as if he'd spent his last moments in a state of terror. The public never found out what happened. The cover-up story was that poor Billy had been taken by cardiac arrest. Internally, it was the scandal to end all scandals. Worst case of incompetence and negligence in history, they called it. They brought the hammer down on anyone even tangentially involved. Me and Taft were out on our ears, and they would have prosecuted us too, but that would have required admitting it ever happened. But I just could never wrap my head around it. Of those dozens of witnesses, not a single person noticed we were strapping a guard to the chair, not an inmate. It was impossible to the point of absurdity. Glass had been the man in that chair. I'd never been more certain of anything in my life. Some months later, I noticed power flickering off all over the city one evening. It was brief, so I thought nothing of it, at least until I got a call from a familiar number the very next morning. "I understand you were one of the staff who regularly worked with one Joseph Glass. We would like to consult with you about an evolving situation. Oh, at 7 p.m. yesterday, we attempted the execution of Joseph Glass for the second time." There was a long pause, and when the voice returned, the professionalism had melted away, replaced with a baffled anxiety. And, well, it didn't work. I blinked. "It didn't what?" There came a long sigh. "Perhaps it'd be best if you saw for yourself." And just like that, me and Taft had our jobs back. Officially, Joseph Glass had been successfully executed on August 18th, 1999. Unofficially, they'd tried again 6 months later, just to tie up loose ends. This time, he hadn't even had the courtesy to pretend to die. He just sat there on the chair, motionless and unaffected, while the CO who'd flipped the switch suddenly seized up and began to convulse, screaming and gnashing and wailing as electricity seared him beneath his skin, clawing at his chest until his eyes popped in his skull and rolled down his face like melted candle wax. All around him, lights flickering, machines bursting from pressure, electrical panels vomiting arcs of static. It was a mess. The feds were crawling all over this case now from a department I've never heard of. Something about investigating preternatural activity. They told me Glass was refusing to speak with anybody but the COs who'd once cared for him. Being walked into that interrogation room almost made me feel like I myself was a convict being marched to his execution. Glass was staring at me when I walked in, like he'd been sat there motionless, waiting for me. I expected nothing less. I took a shuddering breath as I sat across from him. I'd sat across from serial killers and psychos before and showed no hint of fear. But how could I not now, sitting across from a man who can kill people without touching them? Glass. Officer Mendez. His tone betrayed no emotion. "I had thought you'd abandoned me." I winced. No, Glass, I'd just been temporarily relieved. "It's good to see you again. Would you like a glass of water?" I offered it to him. He didn't even look at it. His eyes just bored into mine, relentless. I'm here to ask you a few questions." Silence. "Okay, Glass, I need to know, How you killed Billy and Kramer. I didn't, he replied. It did. It? The thing standing behind you. I didn't bother to turn around. I had enough experience with prisoners trying to trick me into looking the other way while they pulled off some half-baked escape plan. Glass, please, let's take this seriously, I replied. I've always treated you with respect, haven't I? You've never had any problems with me. Actually, I do. I have a problem with all of you. Oh. You here all believe that death is a punishment. There was the first hint of emotion I'd ever heard in his voice. It's not. It's freedom. The only freedom. You promised me that gift. You promised me you'd let me die. You've given it to so many other prisoners while leaving me behind. With all of your machines and your science and your knowledge, surely you can find a way, if anyone. My throat felt suddenly dry. I had to take a sip of the water myself and hoped it would quell my burning nerves. We're trying our best, Glass, but you have to work with us. It may help if you told us what exactly is preventing us from executing you. He moved for the first time, leaning in so slow as to be almost imperceptible. It won't let me die. And that's when I felt a hand settle on my shoulder from behind. Everything stopped. My lungs stopped inflating. I swear my heart stopped beating and my blood froze in place in my veins, and it all felt so cold. I could see the hand in the corner of my eyes, long and veiny and black. I could feel the breath on the back of my neck. I'd once mocked the way deers froze in headlights. Now I understood. I couldn't move, I couldn't blink, I couldn't think, I couldn't even take a single breath. Even as my lungs began to cry out for air, and my vision blurred and my thoughts melded together, all I could see was Joseph's eyes staring into mine. Those infinite fathoms of darkness, that Stygian sea that swirled and stormed and thundered in the blackness of his iris, and the eyes of things waiting a million leagues below the waters. And I would have suffocated there, too terrified to even breathe, if those agents in black had not called off the interrogation then and come storming into the room. Later, they showed me the tapes from the security camera. There'd been nothing behind me, nothing placing its thin hand upon my shoulder, nothing at all. On May 7th, 2001, Glass was set to be executed for the third time, via hanging, or so I heard, in some government black site somewhere, far from prying eyes. While it was set to happen, me and Taft were sharing glasses of scotch in his office, nominally to celebrate. Really, because we were scared. Taft always struck me as young at heart, despite his years, but this was the first time the warden had ever looked truly, properly old. He watched the yard below as he had a drink. Did I ever tell you why I chose this line of work, Mendez? I shook my head, and he sighed. Back in '63, they found a woman's body in the back seat of a burnt-out car in some state park near my neighborhood. A prostitute. One of her Johns had chopped her up, burned all the evidence. And you know what got me, Mendez? Nobody cared. Nobody bothered to investigate. Who will notice one less hooker on the corner of Fifth Avenue, right? It didn't sit right with me. The way I see it, Mendez, every life matters, even the ones we try and cast aside. Everybody's got people who love them and childhood memories and all that. Everybody deserves justice, no matter who they were. He set down his glass and looked me in the eyes. So I joined the force, got the case reopened, found the guy, and I watched him fry. And I like to imagine she was there watching too as he burned. There was a tense moment, and then a chuckle. Of course, after that bullet to the hip in '71, I couldn't walk the beat anymore. But I've been just as happy here. Watching justice be served, it makes me feel like there's some kind of karmic order to the world. Good deeds and bad deeds get repaid in kind. It was clear there was something lurking beneath his words, some unspoken thesis. Eventually, with old, wrinkled, tired eyes, he said it. I've thought about it, and if Glass doesn't die tonight, I'm finally going to retire, Mendez, he confessed. After what he did to those girls, what kind of order can there be in a world where a monster like that is just beyond justice? I was shocked. Warden Taft always struck me as an unmoving fixture. What would we do without him? He'll die, sir, I promised. It'll work this time. It has to. But he seemed deeply uncertain. With one last shuddering drink, he leaned forward. His eyes. He stared at my expression as if desperate for me to understand, for me to know. Those things in his eyes, haven't you seen them? And at that moment, Taft was yanked up out of his chair, It was so sudden, so inexplicable, I could barely register what I was witnessing. Some unseen force lifted him 2 or 3 feet above the ground, dangling him there. He choked, coughed, and sputtered, desperate to gasp down air which would not come, and clawed at something around his neck which I could not see. He was hanging, I realized, and with wide, horrified eyes, the same as Billy's had been, he silently begged me for help. I sprang from my chair and wrapped my arms around his dangling legs. At first, I tried to pull him down to the floor, but I realized it was only tightening the invisible noose around his neck. Then I tried lifting him as high as I could, which gave him some relief, but not much. Tears rolled down his face as it swelled and turned blue, and even though I could not see the noose, I could see the bruised purple skin where it had squeezed around his neck. All the while, I screamed myself hoarse. "Help! Somebody, please! Jesus Christ! We need help in here!" But nobody came. And all of a sudden, some unseen force seemed to sweep my feet out from under me. I dropped like a bag of bricks, but I was so startled I maintained my grip around the warden's legs. I fell and yanked him down with me, and his body suddenly jolted with a sickening crack. It took me a while to manage the courage to look up at him. His neck had been stretched far too long, and his head was bent to the side at almost a 90-degree angle. Eyes wide, round and bloated tongue hanging from dry lips. And then whatever force had suspended him disappeared, and his body fell upon me while I screamed and screamed. I came bursting from his office to find my coworkers casually chatting and working just outside. Somehow, despite all my screaming and begging while Taft was dying, none of them had heard a thing. I took a page from Taft. I wanted out. We were dealing with something unholy here, something whose tendrils could reach any distance, and my life, who knows, maybe even my soul, was at hazard. But the agents in the sharp suits made one thing clear. If I refused to cooperate, well, I would make the perfect scapegoat for the murder of Warden Taft. I was marched into the interrogation room to find a Joseph Glass that had abandoned all pretense of humanity. His eyes had darkened to a pure black. Or perhaps he had no eyes at all, only windows into some place of outer darkness. I was shaking like a leaf as I sat in front of him, feeling more like a prisoner than he was. Mr. Glass. No reply. I shuddered, trying to focus on my little piece of paper to distract myself from the blackness of his eyes. I have some questions I'm supposed to ask you. Is that okay? Silence. I take a deep breath. How old are you, Glass? I thought it was just one of those basic questions. Conversation starters, really. I couldn't have prepared myself for his answer. I am old, child. His voice was nothing like I remembered. It was deep and low and rumbling like there were multiple people speaking in unison, and all were equally ancient. Older than you could possibly know, older than this nation, and older even than the empire that once bore it. I had to fight the basic animal instinct to flee. Focus on the questions, I thought. Why did you do what you did to those girls? Just so I could feel something again, he whispered. Anything. Did you not feel the slightest bit of guilt? Remorse? You ask that of me? Me, who has watched empires rise and fall. He almost sounded amused. Does time feel remorse? For time has killed far more than I. But mankind is like the Hydra. All I've killed will be replaced by essentially identical stock and in greater numbers, and then they will die and be replaced, and so the cycle will continue forever. Did you expect me to pity them for being given the death I myself covet? Only the dead are given leave of the cycle. It is a blessing. And suddenly he stood from his chair as if he'd never been restrained at all. A blessing you promised me, Officer Mendez. I stared up at him in disbelief. What? How did you? But I couldn't even stammer a sentence out before he was upon me, crawling over the table with the eerie grace of a spider. These were no longer the imperceptible hints of emotions I'd come to expect. It was like a switch had been flipped. Tears streamed down his cheeks, snarling with genuine rage, hurt, betrayal. And beneath those black seas in his eyes, all the things that haunted the fathoms below were rising to the surface. You owe me a death. Make good on your word. Pay your debt. I cried out and recoiled from his every touch with disgust, but he was stronger than he looked. I couldn't worm my way out of his impossible grip. I won't. Get off of me, you sick bastard. Do it. Pay me what you owe. It was like 1,000 different voices screaming in my ear. Straining and weeping, I locked my hands around his neck and pressed my thumbs against his throat, trying to strangle him. But instead, I could just feel that grip upon my own neck, squeezing the life out of myself as my lungs burned for air. Yet I kept pressing harder and harder, as if hoping I might somehow break through whatever unholy force was protecting him. And then those terrible hands grasped my shoulders again, and I was paralyzed by a terror that could be called nothing but ancient and primal. Like the thing standing behind me was the same force that had kept my ancestors huddled terrified in their caves 100,000 years ago. And every one of those voices was crying out to me through my very blood, and it pulled me from my chair, threw me as though I were weightless. And the next thing I knew, I was waking up in the infirmary. Once more, none of this was captured on the security camera. In the footage, I just enter the room and have a seat with strange, almost robotic movements. And then the both us just sit there, staring at each other, without speaking, without moving, without blinking. For an hour. After this, Joseph Glass entered a catatonic state, and from then on refused to converse with even me. Now that my usefulness had ended, the agents discarded me like yesterday's trash. Don't even seem to care if I tell anybody. Who would believe me? I thought I'd gotten lucky, that my nightmare was over. I couldn't have been more wrong. Go sorting through any public records and you won't find a single mention of the name Joseph Glass. They've squirreled him away in that off-the-books black site and scrubbed away every other trace of him. I'd say he'd been unpersoned, if indeed he could ever be called a person at all. But they're still trying every execution method in the book. I don't know quite why. Maybe it's for research. I'm sure the US military would love to find the secret to making its men as unkillable as glass, and besides, they're not the ones who have to deal with the consequences. On June 3rd, 2005, they tried a firing squad. I know this because me and my wife were out on our second honeymoon, slow dancing by the lake at night to our favorite song when I felt a wetness against my chest. I looked down to see her eyes as gray and dull as foggy glass, and her chest shredded to Swiss cheese by rounds that made no sound. On December 23, 2012, they tried lethal injection. That was the day they found my son's car wrapped around a tree, and baffled coroners discovered that he was dead before the accident even occurred. His bloodstream polluted with pavulon and potassium chloride. It's been years since I've isolated myself from everyone I knew, hermiting away in this cabin out in the middle of nowhere, and yet the stench of death still follows me. Just a couple years ago, I found a news report mentioning my nephew. Apparently, he'd been found completely exsanguinated, his veins emptied utterly despite no signs of a struggle. God knows what kind of arcane methods of execution they're trying by now. He's not going to let me walk away from this. Not while I still owe him a debt. But I've been doing some research too. Research into those untold legions of things I witnessed staring up from that blackened sea in Glass's eyes. I've learned things men were not meant to know. Practiced rites, assembled tools, ingredients, and I think I know where they're keeping him. Even though they blindfolded me, I counted the second between every turn on our way to the black site, and I've since spent weeks watching the place, cataloging every entry point. Maybe I'm slipping into madness, or maybe I've truly found the way to put an end to the horror, to finally give this monster the justice that Taft would have wanted for him. Joseph Glass had been right about one single thing. I have to pay what I owe, even if it kills me. Dylan's diary. Someone we didn't know tried to pick Dylan up from school today, said his elementary teacher. The guy said he was Dylan's older brother. Dylan doesn't have a brother, I said, alarmed. We thought so too, replied the teacher. I suspected something wasn't right straight away. It was this tall, lanky guy with black hair, looked in his late 30s, maybe even 40. He knew your address, was Dylan's full name and birthday, and which class he was in. I went inside to check with the principal. When I came back out, the guy was gone. I was silent for a second as I stood facing the teacher outside the school gate. The gate separated the main road and a large playground and basketball court leading into the school. All the other kids and parents had left, and we were the only ones standing outside. Where's Dylan now? I asked. He's waiting for you in the principal's office, she said, gesturing for me to follow as she turned around. I walked across the playground behind her shakily, then through the corridors to the office. My 8-year-old son Dylan sat on the couch in the principal's office, still as a stone. The principal sat behind her desk, and there was a cop standing next to her. "Hey, buddy," I said. "You okay?" Dylan looked at me blankly. My Dylan was always a quiet boy. It was just the two of us at home at the time. I was a single dad. My late wife Angie, Dylan's mother, died a year prior. She'd been hit by a car while cycling around a sharp bend, and they never identified the driver. I won't go into any more detail here, as frankly I'd rather not relive that period, but safe to say it destroyed me. I tried to pick up the pieces and stay strong for Dylan. Was I doing a good job? Only God knows. I received no feedback. Since then, Dylan became even more withdrawn, pretty much remaining silent until spoken to. He was seen by a child psychologist and various other members of the welfare team at school, but after assessment, they were sure he didn't have autism or the like. He could speak up when he was pressed. He was just shy and preferred to keep to himself. The cop confirmed I was Dylan's dad, then asked me a few questions. He finally told us they'd try and find the guy and to report if we ever saw him again. The principal and teacher said a few things. It was a blur. All I remember is sweating profusely with my knees shaking, trying to comprehend the fact that someone had tried to kidnap my son. "Dylan, you didn't know that man, did you?" asked the principal. Dylan shook his head. I was on edge after that day. Dylan was my whole world, all the family I had left, and I couldn't stand the possibility that he could be in danger. It made me sick. Who was this bastard? Why my son? Did he know us, or was it some random creep? I always walked Dylan to and from school thereafter and was never late to pick him up again. Meanwhile, Dylan himself didn't seem rattled in the slightest. He never mentioned the incident unless specifically asked. At the time, I thought he was just timid and didn't want to cause trouble. A couple of weeks later, after the incident, the same homeroom teacher called me during her lunch break. She said one of the kids in her class saw Dylan talking to a man through the school fence. When she rushed out, the man was gone. When Dylan was asked about it, he said he hadn't been talking to anyone. The girl who apparently spotted him was questioned further, and she was adamant she saw Dylan talking to a tall, lanky man with messy black hair. The cops were called again, did a quick search of the perimeter of the school, but they found no one suspicious. That afternoon, I sat Dylan down at the kitchen table. "I won't get angry, I just need you to tell me the truth," I said, trying to steady my nerves. "Did you or didn't you talk to a stranger today at school? Yes or no?" He shrugged. Getting an answer out of him was harder than drawing blood from a stone. "How many times have we told you not to talk to strangers? It's for your own safety. You do understand that, don't you, son?" He nodded, looking slightly afraid. I realized I had raised my voice and felt guilty immediately. Exasperated and running on 2 hours of sleep, I left him at the dining table and went straight to bed. That night, I woke at 2 a.m. and went for a bathroom trip. I decided to check on Dylan while I was at it. He wasn't in his room. I called out his name and looked around in the living room and kitchen, getting more frantic as the seconds ticked by. I checked wardrobes, corners, even in cupboards, which made no sense to look in as he'd never fit in them. But I was desperate, thinking he'd been kidnapped. I went out into the street, yelling his name as I ran up and down it like a maniac, to no avail. As I came back into the house, ready to call the police, I looked in Dylan's room for one last check. He was sitting up on his bed, wide awake and staring back at me. "Where were you?" I asked, relieved but still alarmed. "I was here," he replied. "No, you weren't. I was looking everywhere for you and you weren't in here." "I was." Had I imagined all of that? I shook my head, feeling a migraine coming on. "Just stay in your room, okay? Don't scare me." I thought my eyes had deceived me somehow and the paranoia was getting to me. Perhaps I should have paid attention to the fact that the window was wide open. About a year after those incidents, I heard a knock at my apartment door. I was inside doing some paperwork while Dylan was in his room playing Minecraft. I was on alert immediately. No one ever knocked on the door. We lived in a block of apartments, and friends or acquaintances would always wait outside the main door, ring the doorbell, and I would greet them downstairs. This meant it was likely an upstairs or downstairs neighbor who needed something. I had a few of their numbers from when we moved in for contact should the need ever arise, but we weren't close at all. I wondered what could be the problem. I walked up to the door and looked outside the peephole. There was no one there. Odd, I thought. Perhaps I had heard something. Those random occurrences were commonplace now, and second-guessing myself was just in my nature at that point. As I walked back to my desk in the living room, I heard another knock. Something was up. I walked up to the door again. No one seen through the peephole? Was someone pranking us? I stood just behind the door and texted my upstairs neighbor asking him if he'd knocked on the door. A few moments later, I heard footsteps upstairs that went in the direction of the door, then hurriedly back into the apartment. I then received a text back about a minute later. Do not open the door. There's a guy with a huge knife crouching, hiding right next to your door. My phone buzzed again, another text from my upstairs neighbor. Calling cops RN. Stay inside. I froze as all the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I was paralyzed for a few seconds. When I came to my senses, I tiptoed to Dylan's room. Stay inside. Keep quiet, I whispered, my eyes bulging, beads of sweat dripping down my forehead. I had never felt my heart beat so fast. Dylan looked up and raised his eyebrows as I shut his door slowly and stood outside it, about to throw up and shit myself at the same time. We were so still that I could make out quiet but frantic talking upstairs and more rushing footsteps. I read my upstairs neighbor's texts again to make sure my eyes hadn't deceived me. I tiptoed to the kitchen and grabbed one of my own kitchen knives, then returned to the same spot outside Dylan's room, anticipating a crazed psycho busting down the door at any second. I chanted manic prayers for safety on repeat in my head. Not a sound came from inside his room. After what seemed like years, I heard sirens in the distance, and my heart rate started to slow a little. My grip on the knife handle loosened. Eventually, I heard some shouting, more footsteps and banging that gradually faded in volume. "This is the police!" shouted a voice. I looked through the peephole to confirm that it was a cop, then opened the door, knife still in hand. They were very reassuring and informed us that a tall, lanky man with black hair had just been apprehended and taken into police custody. He had knocked on my door and was waiting for someone inside to open it. He was indeed waiting with a freshly sharpened knife. What was he going to do with it to the first person who opened that door, which was going to be me? Well, if it isn't obvious, then your guess is as good as mine. This guy's name was Gregory. He seemed to bounce around from place to place with no permanent address, even traveling between states and doing petty crimes like theft, harassment, and occasionally stalking minors. When they did a more thorough search, it turns out he had been involved in at least one gruesome murder in a different state and ended up being given a life sentence for it, along with his accomplices. I wouldn't have wished that terror upon anyone, but these unfortunate things happen. The side effects of the psychological damage I experienced that day have never left me. However, I know people who have been through similar horrors, but never lived to tell the tale, so I looked on the bright side and counted myself lucky. Where there are sick freaks, there will be victims. The sicko was in jail, and I thought that was the end of it. But there was a different side to the story that I only uncovered 10 years after the incident. Dylan was due to leave for college, living away from home for the first time. He had grown into a tall kid with a surprising number of friends, still obedient, but relentlessly quiet. While packing his things and clearing out his room, I found a rugged-looking old notebook at the back of his bottom drawer. "Dylan's diary," said the cover. I flicked through it with no intention to pry initially and saw that he had written and drawn in it extensively, with impressively neat handwriting. He had always been a boy of few words, so I was intrigued. I began reading from the first page. Page 1. Cody's house, 11 a.m. He has to give me back my coat. There were a few stick figure drawings. Page 2. I need a book for English class next week. Ask if Amy has one. I turned the pages, and the first few were filled with the same mundane elementary school day-to-day affairs, mixed in with a few doodles. Then I got to page 21. Page 21. Why does my dad talk so much? He won't even let me get an Xbox, and he won't let me sleep over at Cody's house. Talking back is no use. I hate him. I felt a sting, and my heart sank. I remembered that day vividly, and a pang of guilt ran through me. I turned the page. Page 22. Saw Greg today. He says he can help me get rid of Dad. I said he was lying, but he says he's done it before. It was in the news. As my mind connected the dots, I flicked through the previous pages. This was the first mention of Greg I could find. I started to sweat, but continued reading. Page 23. Me and Greg are coming up with a plan. Need Dad gone. But I almost got caught talking to him today. Mrs. Watford, that stupid old mole rat, kept asking me. She took me to the principal's office again. I think Katie saw Greg and snitched. Need to be careful. A few blank pages with a few in between filled with scribbles and admin-type notes to self. Then the narrative continued. Page 41. The word plan was underlined, with 2 drawings underneath. The first was of a stick figure kneeling by a door holding what looked like a dagger. This stick figure was smiling. There was another stick figure behind the door, with its hand on the door handle, about to open the door. The second was of the first stick figure stabbing the stick man who had just opened the door, his eyes now 2 crosses. Page 42. Greg came to my house, and I showed him my plan. He said it was good, and he could do it. We almost got caught by Dad, but I got back in bed just in time. He's gonna get some tools from his house. Close one. Greg screwed up. He's in jail now. Why did Dad not open the door when Greg knocked? Everything went wrong. I don't know why. Page 44. I wish my dad would just shut up. I flicked through the rest of the notebook, which was blank. Page 44 was the last entry. I read the entries a few times and pondered what I should do. I never thought Dylan was capable of such heinous intentions. Confused and upset, I acted as if nothing had happened for a few days, but on the day he was due to leave for college, I couldn't hold it in anymore. I brought his duffel bag down and hooked it on his suitcase. He was ready to head to the station, standing outside the door with the suitcase and his backpack. Dylan, when you were younger, did I ever say or do anything that hurt you? You can be honest with me. No. No. Why do you ask? He replied. I held up the diary. He froze for a second, and I saw the color drain from his face. I won't blame you for anything. Don't worry. You know I love you very much, son. You were a minor, and you were a victim of a very sick man. Besides, this thing is years old. I just want to know what I did wrong at the time to lead to this, and we can put it behind us. His shocked expression faded, leaving his ever-present blank stare. You didn't do anything wrong. Neither did Mom. I opened my mouth to ask him what he meant by that, but stopped. The corners of his mouth stretched into a wide smile. Our eyes met, and we stood in silence for a few seconds. Dylan, if I were to find another one of these notebooks, I began tactfully, would I see the blueprint of my wife's murder inside? Yeah. He didn't even pause to answer. Then he gripped the handle of his suitcase and walked off down the street. That was 2 years ago now. Now that God has revealed himself, none of us are allowed to die. It was a Thursday when God revealed himself to all of humanity. The day started ordinary enough, but sometime in the afternoon, I felt a presence in my chest and a voice in my ear. I have returned, the voice said. As it just so happened that everyone had heard that voice, everyone felt that presence. And soon everyone stepped out of their dwellings and looked up at the sky and saw the clouds disappear and a brilliant light shine for just an instant, a moment, a light so brilliant it couldn't have belonged to the sun and it had to have been something else. And it was clear. The feeling in our hearts was certain. The Lord was real, and he was here. What happened next was likely what you would have expected. The world became kinder, more compassionate, not by virtue of an intrinsic force of goodness overtaking us, but rather the fear of retribution. You didn't want to fight, didn't want to insult, didn't want to judge, because you didn't know what would happen when you did. A safe life, with the recent supernatural developments, was one that contained a bit more charity, a bit more turning the other cheek, and a bit more feigned grace. Fake it till you make it, after all. I watched for signs of what would change next. We were all under the watchful eye, but it at least felt incorrectly, we would realize, that the Almighty's interventions had been minimal so far. Everyone found out at their own pace that death had become a thing of the past. Some knew immediately when their loved ones in hospice care saw remarkable turnarounds in health. Others missed the memo until mass consensus had been established, when scientists and statisticians alike revealed that by every known metric, natural disasters, car crashes, heart attacks, the number of daily reported deaths had plummeted from an average of 160,000 to zero. Life went on, and as it did, I started hearing whispers of what worship was. Depending on who you talked to, online or at the water cooler, you'd hear a different rumor, a different interpretation. It wasn't until my mom was called upon that I knew what it was. I remember it vividly. 7 o'clock, after dinner, Mom got up from her seat in the living room, got ready, donned her coat, stepped towards the shoe rack. "Where you heading, hun?" my father asked her. "I've been summoned." "I'm sorry. The Lord has summoned me for worship." I remember just how odd the moment felt. Life had been tinged with a certain unreality since the grand question was blown wide open. Seeing Mom head for the door both did and didn't make any sense. Had it been any other year, we would have thought she was doing a bit. "Did you, need a ride?" my dad asked confusedly. "The Lord would like me to walk," she responded. Then she turned the knob and went outside. I was 17 at the time. My brother was 20. We both asked Dad if we should follow her. He told us to stay home, that he'd accompany her and figure out what was going on. He didn't return until the next evening. We rushed downstairs when we heard the front door open, hoping we'd catch both parents entering. Instead, it was just him, disheveled, weary, a muted expression on his face. I'll never forget the way he looked at us. "She's standing in a field," he said. Then, "There are other people there too." 4 months passed since Mom was first called to worship. During that time, we learned something more about God's interventions. The new commandments, as I'd termed them in my brain, were panning out as the following: "Thou shalt not die," via disease, natural disasters, etc. "Thou shalt be called to worship at a random time." Now, I'll admit neither of those are as catchy as the OG commandments. This is, after all, not the official word of the Lord, merely just my reading of the tea leaves. Commandment 3 came to me in a dream. Kidding, it came to me in a YouTube video. It was your usual street fight video. 2 guys on a sidewalk corner, for reasons unknown, exchanging blows, until the bigger of the 2 got the upper hand and started wailing and wailing, then secured a knife and, like a light bulb went off in his head, stopped, lifted himself from his rival. The guy getting his ass handed to him stood up also, and then both of them just walked. Single file, empty expressions on their faces. Manchurian candidate shit. So, 3. "If thou attempt to kill another, thou shalt immediately be summoned to worship," was the takeaway. But what, pray tell, was worship really? I visited my mom one afternoon to understand better. The spot she had journeyed to was an hour's drive from home, so she must have trekked for hours that first night. I arrived at the field, to the sight of thousands of people standing evenly spaced, 3 feet apart in every direction. They all faced the same way, heads tilted slightly towards the sky, perfectly still. No movement. I maneuvered the rows for what felt like an endless amount of time. When I finally found her, it genuinely felt like I just got lucky. It was my first time seeing her since she'd been gone. I had mentally convinced myself that there was no need for me to come out here. After all, she'd be coming home any day now. "Mom," I'll admit, I was a bit emotional. To my surprise, despite her fixed posture and eyes tilted up, her mouth moved. "Hi, sweetheart. How are you?" "I'm well. I am in worship." She wasn't totally being herself. "Mom, are you able to move?" "I am in worship," she repeated. "But do you want to come home?" The softness in her tone didn't change, but it did seem like she was imbuing her words with some kind of subtext, trying to say something more. "I can't, love." And then enunciated even clearer, "I think you should go home, perhaps before you're forced to stay too." But, home. Get going now, dear. I told her I loved her, then departed through the gathering of worshipers. All of them laid out so absolutely perfectly, like a chessboard. Everyone had their spot, and there was plenty of land to go. So much so that I had to wonder what spots myself, my friends, dad, older brother, and everyone I'd ever loved would potentially occupy one day. En route, I spotted a few other visitors. They looked more morose than I was. They whispered words of affirmation and love to their respective persons. Hearing responses, sure, but said responses from the corner of their loved one's mouth seeming light, quiet, curt, God-centric. Like they were standing at someone's gravesite, albeit more a statue than a grave, a commemoration of someone long gone. But no one was really gone. Mom hadn't left. Worship would be over soon. It had to be. Maybe another couple of weeks, couple months at most, and then she'd be home and the Lord would call someone else to take her place. 4. When thou art in worship, thou shalt not age. Commandment 4 became common knowledge a year later. The amount of folks called to worship had steadily gone up during this time. This was global, of course, so anyone curious could at any time look up a live stream of the designated worship areas around the world to see people standing uniformly, frozen, perfectly spaced in parks, beaches, city squares, you name it. Every town, every city had its place. My place, I supposed, would be the same field where Mom was, unless it filled up by the time it was my turn. In which case, it could very well have been somewhere completely random and unknown. The no-aging revelation was again something discerned by the ever-decreasing amount of practicing scientists on the planet. Worship grief was a real term now. Not yet coined was the secret counterpart buried in all our brains that God knows, literally, we weren't brave enough to speak. Worship fear. I tried my best to keep my thoughts pure. I couldn't help but assume that thoughts of blasphemy contained within the 17 or so centimeters of my brain were fair game for our omnipotent ruler to scrutinize. It was a nice fantasy, though. The idea that there might be a spot, a street corner without God's CCTV camera, somewhere you could just be you, without fear that your insubordination would expedite the ticket to your special place on God's canvas. Support groups existed, and so I joined one, and that's where the no-aging element of worship was first pitched to me as one of the many pros of the whole construction. I didn't find Commandment 4 comforting, but I smiled and nodded nonetheless. The world was still the world, but less so. I'd take the train to work and notice that the average of people's expressions had gone from tired and cranky to subtly mortified. I once saw a woman break down and start crying, and I can almost swear she said under her breath, "I don't want to go." Or maybe I was just projecting. Nightmares weren't the same anymore. The worst dream I could have now wasn't one where I was being chased by a murderer or caught in a storm. Rather, the one where I would stop in place while I was doing something mundane. I would hear a voice in my head. The voice would say, "You have been summoned." My feet would start walking on their own, and I'd know exactly where I was going, even if I didn't know where it was. I'd jolt awake in my bed, sweating, praying, funny as it were, that I still had executive function. That, and the little moments where I'd feel a random twitch or spasm in my leg, those were the killers. And then 4 years passed, and it must have been close to 30% of the global population then in worship. My dad, an unfortunate addition to that communion. My brother and I never got a chance to see him exit stage left into the crowd. The day that he was called upon, he was out and about. I believe he'd gone to see the mechanic and maybe had a physio appointment on the docket afterwards too. That didn't matter now. We held out hope until the third day of him being gone. The field where Mom stood was full now, and at this point, our city had quite a few landmarks for congregation. My brother and I took turns visiting these different areas to see if we could maybe catch our dad standing amongst the crowd. No luck. Around then, I started coming around to what the fifth commandment might have been. Again, this was just me spitballing, but getting any sense of rules or structure during this time was oddly a place of comfort. It was nice to know what, if any, parameters there were to this. It was a redundant rule, really, as I'm sure you'll understand once I spell it out clearly. The thought came to me when I'd see people standing atop high rises, right close to the edge, as if they were about to leap, and then they'd just turn around. Or when I'd spot people on the bridge, walking alongside the cars, albeit robotically, and I'd wonder if I was just being a cynic, or if maybe some of the pedestrians strolling alongside traffic had originally arrived with ulterior motives. With my brother's mistake, it all became clear. I walked into his room one day to catch him sitting at his desk, a gun pressed to his temple, his hand trembling, the barrel shaking, finger resting on the trigger. I froze in place, and I'll admit, I had the following thought. Please, please God, let the bullet pass through his skull. Let him die. Instead, the gun fell to the ground. His hands ceased quaking. He stood up from his chair, walked to his closet, grabbed his coat, put it on. Marcus? I asked. Just gonna head out, he said. 2. Worship, he said matter-of-factly. I've been called upon. He headed for the front door. I trailed. Marcus, I said again. He ignored me. Listen, I'm only asking out of curiosity. I tried not to sign my own release form with my words. Are you able to control your body at all? Even a little bit? No, and I am going to worship. You can't even. If you were feeling the call, it would be clear to you too, and now I need to go. He grabbed his shoes. I walked him the whole way there, 5 hours, until he took his spot in the cleared-out parking lot of a now defunct amusement park, alongside thousands of men, women, and children. He didn't say anything to me on the trek there, though to be fair, I didn't say much to him either. 5. If thou attempt to take thine own life, you guessed it, thou shalt immediately be summoned to worship. Gallows humor. The world coped with gallows humor. 70% of the world, after all, give or take, was in the worship state now. I tried my best not to think about it. Standing still, head turned towards the sky, body frozen for weeks, months, or in the case of my mom and dad, years on end. It was selfish, but I would struggle to visit my mother. When I did go, it would be for a quick side hug, a quick I love you, and then a hasty exit. I would always wish that she were in a deep trance state, too out of it to return the greeting, but she was instead consistently lucid. Love you too, sweetheart, she'd say, way too presently. It made me uncomfortable. To be that awake, that aware of what was going on, I didn't like it. The headcanon I was trying to run with was that worship would be a blissful, effortless, dreamlike state. All of the evidence was to the contrary. To God's credit, it seemed like we could talk about worship fear quite openly. Certainly, all of the support groups, online communities and such were reflecting a different, more honest state for man. YouTube videos and TikTok clips talking about a surefire way to escape, tactics to reality shift out of this timeline to another. Deep states of meditation that would allow you to pass peacefully without being summoned to one of God's many gathering grounds. And of course, all too many video essays scrutinizing the Lord, complaining about the state of things. Calling for revolution. Madness, really. There were 2 moments that stuck with me. Moments that really captured the spirit of things. The first was the final video of that guy who was planning an elaborate Rube Goldberg-esque escape from his physical body. Doused himself and his room in gasoline, held a string tied to a blade suspended above his head, had a timer with an explosion counting down. I commended the hell out of his effort. The moment hit, he tossed a match from his seat to the corner. Flames ignited, he pulled the string, and then the fire fizzled as soon as it reached him. The blade froze in mid-air. The explosion never happened. Thank goodness, really, as the camera footage eventually discovered and uploaded was gold. And then our friend got up from his seat, still dripping and flammable, and walked out of frame. Commandment 5, my friend. Commandment 5. The other was the video of that big streamer who kept faking that he'd been summoned while live on Twitch. His face would go blank, he'd get up from his seat, and he'd mechanically step out of his room. He'd done the fake out so many times that when it was the real thing, chat was in denial for hours. Hilariously horrifying. People still worked, still clung to routine, but it was pretty fruitless. I'd see street preachers with a megaphone telling us that our time was soon. Like, no shit, my guy. Apple, despite most of their workforce having clocked out permanently, still managed to come out with new products somehow. Streaming was mainly reruns, however. Probably hard to commit to a full season of material when your director, lead actor, lead writer, and everyone else on set could step out at a moment's notice and never come back. Less workers everywhere you went. But hey, it made sense. Less customers and all. I picked up a coffee from the Starbucks in my area that still had employees and went off to see my brother. It'd been 2 years. His was the hardest one for me. After all, I knew deep down he wouldn't have wanted me to pity him. But holy shit did I. I returned to the parking lot. It was much busier with people now, at capacity it seemed. I maneuvered the gaps and finally got to him. Hey, I said. Hi, he said. How is it? I saw his chest expand and contract with his steady breaths. Head lifted, eyes angled up. How is it? I asked again. I'm in worship, he said. And it'll probably be my time soon too, I said. Help me prepare. Again, he said nothing. Bro, I said. It took him a while to finally speak. You know, he said, the thought I think about the most is that some random bullet could be flying around somehow. Just a random bullet, fired from hundreds of miles away. And it gets past God's radar, and it catches me in the back of the head. And it all goes black for me. It's my favorite thought. It's the dream that's keeping me going. I didn't say anything. I couldn't say anything. There's a feeling in my chest, a sureness. This isn't going to stop. I felt trapped. It's going to go on for eternity. No heat death, just this. I put my hand on his shoulder, an empty gesture, really. I think I just needed something to help keep me upright. Please find a way to kill me, he said, and then I had to go. I think I heard him say, please stay, I need conversation, or maybe I imagined it, or maybe I heard it bang on clear, but I didn't want to think about it because it made me feel like shit. Survivorship bias is a really strange feeling to have when you're still on the sinking Titanic. Sure, your section of the ship isn't submerged yet, but you would be there soon enough with Leo and the gang, like A's. Whoever was keeping track had stopped counting. Almost everyone was gone. It was dumb luck, pure and simple. Dumb luck that I hadn't been called upon yet. My soft research started the moment Dad disappeared, but you can be damn sure it escalated after the conversation with my brother. I approached everything with an open mind and tried anything I could. Specific meditations, incantations, prayers to the Lord for the global worship session to end. I went to specific coordinates and towns where, rumor had it, people could actually die. My trips were immeasurably disappointing. No death to be found anywhere. The old constants, death and taxes. The new constants, immortality and worship. I was en route to my 80th or so desperate attempt to find salvation, see Annihilation. A picture of a flyer that was shared to one of the many holy shit we need to die ASAP groups I was a part of detailed the church that one Reverend Lucien Ferrer was practicing at. He made lofty promises about his support group that I was sure he wouldn't be able to deliver on. The bottom of the flyer reading much like a pyramid scheme. Join a community with a surefire solution to worship fear. No testimonials because we have a 100% success rate. Come and see the miracle for yourself. But desperate times and all that nonsense. I made the 4-hour drive, on the way spotting some of the many new landmarks of people gathered, perfectly spaced apart, facing the same direction, heads slanted upwards, locked in perpetual admiration for the Lord. It felt like my time was closing in, like I'd stop the car any moment now. Step out, walk along the side of the road until I reached my place. I arrived at the destination. The church looked desolate from the outside. Looked long abandoned. No clue what Reverend Lucien was running here. But hey, if it was just a prank, he got me. I stepped inside, and then I felt it. The lack. The lack of the feeling of the Lord in my chest. It felt like my bond with the Creator had been severed. By the entrance, there was a table with a sign-in form and a pen. I scribbled my name and the time. The interior stretched quite long. I took a seat in the pews. There were a few others seated in the rows. They looked like they'd been waiting for quite some time. After a little while, a man came out on the stage. Just going to be a couple more hours, but he should be seeing to all of you soon, he said. It felt like I was at the doctor's office for an appointment. He didn't reappear for quite some time as promised. Time stood still. I heard the tick-tick-tick of the clock. My hands on my legs. Don't move involuntarily. Don't move involuntarily. He came out, called someone else's name. Thomas Gilmore? Is Thomas Gilmore here? And sure enough, Thomas got up from his seat and followed the man to the back. Tick, tick, tick. Eve Merritt? Eve? That's me. Her hand shot up. That's me. And off she went to the back. Tick, tick, tick. I really, truly didn't know how much time I had left. It just says Lily here, he said, eyeing the sheet. Lily? She's just in the bathroom, another stranger said. All right, we'll take her when she's back. And then the sun was going down. How long would this support session run for? I couldn't wait for them to close up shop for the evening. I couldn't come back tomorrow. I couldn't wait. I couldn't fucking. All right, got a Jake Miller here? Jake. Me. I shouted. Immediately, I stood from my seat. I had the horrific thought that my body would turn itself around. I'd leave the church and walk right into the sunset, but instead my footsteps made their way up the aisle, and then I was standing right in front of him. "To the back," he said, and I followed him there, a rather confusing and twisting pathway past closed doors, boxes, mess, and hallways until we got there. To a confessional booth. "In there?" I asked him. "In there," he said. I entered the booth. There was blood on the seat. Blood. What a novel sight. "Take a seat. Don't worry about the dried. It's fine. You'll be good." "Sit," said who I presumed was the priest sitting on the other side of the partition. I did as he requested. "Reverend Lucian?" I asked. It took him a second to respond, to register. Yes, Reverend Lucian, sure." I continued. "I haven't really done this confessional thing before, but I guess, are you supposed to ask me to confess something?" "Yes, please confess whatever is on your mind." I took a second to gather my thoughts. "Right, yes. So, I heard the sound of something being cleaned by a cloth, followed by a deliberate echoing snap. Was he eating?" "Right, so I saw your ad, found your ad rather, and I suffer from worship fear, I guess. I don't want to commit blasphemy against the Lord or anything, but I heard the echo of another bite. Jesus, a little rude, man. But not sure if I want to stand in a field for 100 years in worship, I guess. It's not 100 years, he said, chewing loudly. It's forever, eternity. That was his little project. His little what now? Heaven on earth, eternity. That was always the plan, for all of you to become one with the Lord for the rest of time. Of course he wanted to show up when there was the most people, right? He said, crunching. Like, probably, he stifled a laugh, probably less exciting when it's fucking cavemen, right? Billions of people? Or 10,000 cavemen? Which would you choose? I'm sorry, what does this have to do with anything? Nothing. Sorry, please continue. Right, I said, gathering, and no, I guess that was it. It said you have a surefire solution on your ad. Yeah, he said. I can kill you. You can kill me? Yeah, right here. Right now. Of course, if you need time to think about it, it's a no. And if you step out of the church, God will summon you right then and there to be a part of the flock. How would you know that? What's your answer? There are people waiting, and I'm a busy guy. Busy, Reverend. The answer would be yes, but that'd be in violation of Commandment 3. Sorry, I guess you don't know what that is. Basically, I've been trying to keep track of everything, and Commandment 3 is my shorthand for the whole, if you try to. Suddenly, the partition fell. Swiftly came the knife into my jugular. I couldn't believe it. Blood spilled onto my shirt, my legs. I gagged, my vision blurring as I tried to focus on the man who delivered the blow. The man who had a bloody knife in one hand, half-eaten apple in the other. The Lord and I have an agreement, he said. He has his space, and I have mine, albeit this one is much smaller than what I'm used to. I felt my head lower involuntarily. My eyes acclimated to the final shot, myself drenched in red. You're welcome, I think I heard him say. And then it all went black. A miracle.